gosh.
Recording in progress. That was my introduction. Good to see you all here this morning. Brave. Fortune favors the brave. Glad you're all here. You've come out amidst this pandemic. I think we're winning. Although Alice was just very sick, right? She goes to the hospital and then gets sick. So glad to see you here. And everybody online too. Glad you're with us. So let's start with a prayer. Let's do that. Lord, thank you for our couple. Thank you that we're here. Pray, Lord, that you would give us protection during this time. Pray, Lord, you would help us to deal physically with this pandemic that we've been wrestling with here for 2 years, and also help us to deal with it spiritually and emotionally. Give us the tools, Lord, that we need to face this time here and now. Thank you, Lord, for these moments. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. Amen. Well, we've got a challenge on our hands. Although this isn't the worst thing that's ever happened to us, we're just having a conversation about that. The Civil War was worse, apparently. We just decided.
But good. That makes me feel better.
Yes, you should feel better. The Civil War was worse than whatever we're dealing with now. People just made it through Thanksgiving fighting with their family members. It has been worse, yes. But this is our time, and this is our time to face. And as we talked about last week, I believe this is actually our 9/11. We've changed. Our life has changed, and going forward, it's going to be different now. Hopefully, the numbers seem to be indicating that this new variant is highly contagious, but not as deadly. That's good news, right? The statistics are. I was just comparing it for a year ago. A year ago, at this time, the number of cases per day, this is per day in California only, peaked at about 41,000 new cases a day. That was a year ago. This month, we did have had that was this month, they peaked at 41,000. A year ago, there were only 15,000. So it's highly more contagious, right? Per day, the highest day a year ago was 15,000 new cases. The highest day just in this last month was 41,000. So we had a huge spike in cases of COVID, this new variant. But compared to deaths, this year, this month, the highest day was 90 per day in California only, and a year ago was 255. So you see the deaths were, even though the cases were many more, the deaths were many less. So it tells you it's highly contagious, not as deadly. That's kind of what Fauci's telling us. So it looks like he's right. The statistics bearing him out. So we should take heart with that. We're going to hopefully move ahead with this flu. But there still are people who get very, very sick and still at risk. So we have to keep taking precautions, but it looks like we're coming through to a new time in our life. And I think things are going to be different going forward. How we act, wearing masks is going to be more common. I think we've been changed by this pandemic that we've gone through, and you'll be talking about this for years. And one of the things that's happened, of course, you know this, is that people are suffering psychologically now more than they were before the pandemic. Big surprise. Just prior to the pandemic, the national average has hovered for years at about 11% of people would say they're struggling with severe anxiety and depression. So that's not unusual. Just last month, it peaked when you ask people the national average, are you struggling with severe anxiety and depression? It's 42%. So that's a lot of people. That means there are many of us in this room who say, you know, in the last 2 years, I've suffered with some pretty severe anxiety, pretty severe depression. So the psychological impact of what's going on in our life is severe. Marital distress is at its highest. I know our phones are ringing off the hook at our counseling center. I'm struggling to get new counselors to join our counseling center because of how many people are calling in with psychological problems that they're trying to fix. So that's what we're talking about. And I think the core of why we're having such a hard time, core of that is fear and isolation. We've been told to isolate. which we need to do physically, but psychologically, that's a terrible thing to do. And fear at the core of that drives us into all of these problems. Now, we're going to unpack fear and what that word means a little bit more today, but I want to try to talk about the impact of fear in our lives from a lot of different angles. And I'd like to do, because I know many of you by name, if you feel like making a comment or asking a question, just jump in. And online, do that too. I know we've got some brilliant people out there. Actually, I'm going to answer one of the questions that people asked last week today. I love coming to the BBC because I get very thoughtful questions. It helps me write my books. One of the things that fear does is it mobilizes us. You've heard of the fight or flight syndrome in response to fear. It's actually the fight, flight, or freeze syndrome. It's really the more accurate description of that. It's our automatic response to danger when something scares us. We have the fight, flight, or freeze response. The freeze response is what happens first. Actually, what happens when we've developed this over thousands and thousands of years, hundreds, maybe thousands of years. If a bear jumps out from behind a tree, the first thing you do is freeze. You decide, should I fight it or should I run? You have to assess the situation. But first, there's a moment of being immobilized. And that, as I talked about last week, that fear response is way faster than you can think. We know that the amygdala responds. We've taken pictures of the brain now that we couldn't do before. The amygdala will respond to a fearful situation 5 times faster than you can even think about it before the prefrontal cortex kicks in. So think about this. If you still, even though you probably don't have bears jump out from behind trees very often, yeah, okay, once in a while, but your brain still is hardwired that way. It hasn't been far enough along for us to not respond that way. So you will get scared before you even know why. That's the way your brain's wired. And you can understand that for survival, right? We need to know when scary things are around us. We react viscerally, quickly. You don't want to stop and contemplate, should I run? Well, what are my options here? Can I talk to the bear, negotiate, throw some food? No, you just run. You need to know quickly when you're afraid. It needs to mobilize you to do things. So, and I said this last week, I'll say it again. So when you're talking with someone who's, say, talking about issues of the pandemic, or they don't vaccinate, they do vaccinate, and you think your thinking doesn't make any sense. You want to say to them, do you realize you're irrational what you're saying? Just take a breath and say this person's scared, as we all are, and so they're just dealing with their fear in the way that makes most sense to them. Trying to argue with someone when they're mobilized by fear doesn't do a lot of good. So it's not a rational situation. It's really more of a limbic system thing. You can sometimes love people into better choices than argue them into better choices. If you have adult children, you know what I mean. So let's quote Genesis 32. Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome. You know the story. Jacob wrestled with God and changed his name. He wrestles with God. There are times in life when you may feel stuck, but what's going on is you're in a protracted freeze response to danger. You may think I've got a problem. You may think maybe I'm sick or something's wrong with me. But maybe what's going on is you're being called to wrestle with something. And you need to learn something from those moments. I think that the freeze response is built in. It's typically meant to only last a few seconds, but some of you have been there for years where you've been stuck. I don't know, do I go out of my house or stay in my house? I'm not sure. I'm stuck and I can't decide what to do. I think those are sometimes opportunities for us to wrestle with God, for us to ask ourselves, what is it that I need to learn? I'm frozen here, and this is an opportunity to wrestle. I've seen that a lot in the last year. Let me tell you about an example. A woman I'll call Helen. Her life is very simple. She gets up every day, brushes her teeth, takes a shower, grabs her coffee, walks across the hall, goes into the other room, goes to work. That's her life. You know this life. You've lived this life. Your commute takes about 15 seconds, to get from your bedroom. And some of you never leave your bedroom. I know. I Zoom with you. You're there all day. You get up, you make up the bed just to make it look different, But it's your office, right? Talk about being stuck. I thought at the beginning when this thing happened, remember 2 years ago when I was here, we thought that we had the lockdown of our country. We all thought this would be 3 weeks long, right? We're still into it, still walking across the hall. Fortunately, my office is actually in a building outside my house, so I get to walk across my lawn and then go to my office. So a little bit longer of a commute. But like many of us during this time of COVID, it makes us feel very stuck. She felt stuck and she was having signs of distress. So she came to therapy, which means she called me and we Zoomed. That's what coming to therapy means now. Because her signs of distress. You see, stress alone won't kill you. Distress is what kills you. And what's distress? Distress is stress with no release. You have activity in your life that creates stress. And in order to live a healthy life, you have activity, stress, release. You have to do something that gives you release, have a break, go for a walk, do something that lets the anxiety and the stress go, and then you're ready for more activity. But what if you have activity, stress, activity, stress, activity, stress, no release? That becomes distress. And distress is when you start having organ problems and your body starts failing and you have the signs of what we call stress, but it's really distress because of a lack of release. And that I'm seeing a lot of people working in their homes, never leaving their homes, staying in their bedroom, and they're working much longer hours because it's their office now. It's here in their bedroom, right? So Helen was one of those people. She was working from the moment she woke up to the moment she went to bed because her computer was just right there, right? And everyone could reach her. Used to be before, she didn't have to work long hours, but people couldn't reach her. Now they know where she is. So her boss can reach her and make requests. She's a great employee, a very hard worker, and she could never say no to her boss. So by the time she came to see me, she was working ridiculous hours and doing the work of at least 3 people because she could. She says, I sleep 8 hours a night and I wake up tired every day. And I said, I can see why you're so exhausted. All you do is work. She said, I know, but if I don't do it, nobody will. My boss is an idea man, so I'm the person who actually has to make things happen. And I said, so what would happen if you didn't do all this work? She said, well, I couldn't do that. Things would back up. I'm stuck in a bad situation. I don't see any way out of it. Now, I have to say, I kind of admire Helen's work ethic. There are a lot of people today that don't share that work ethic, and I kind of admire that she's a very responsible person. But something else I think was going on for her. It just wasn't her love of the work that made her work these long hours, right? She was stuck because she was, not just because she was conscientious, I think she was stuck because she was afraid. She was afraid of being a disappointment, but she would simply say, I don't want to disappoint my boss. That's the way she would put it. I'm always suspicious of that. Really? That's what that is? I'm not even sure if you like your boss, but you don't want to disappoint him. So we began our conversation. In psychology, we have an axiom. It's called the thing is not the thing. I'm sure you've heard me say that before. What you think the thing is, it's usually not. Once we dig deeper, we find that the thing isn't the thing. It's something else that's the real thing, right? So we like to hang our fears on what we think the thing is. And her thing was, well, I don't want to disappoint my boss. But as she talked about him, I was just suspicious that just really wasn't the deeper issue that was going on. So I finally get her to talk about not just her work and her boss, which is all she wanted to talk about, but talk about things before that. I'd say, well, when was the first time you thought that? Or when was the first time you felt that? We just keep going back and back, and then I find out she had an absent father and an overwhelmed mother with 3 kids. And to ensure her place in the family, she became the good daughter, the one who did it. She was the oldest. So people take on roles, right? She looked around, mom was overwhelmed, dad was gone. There's, two other younger kids crying. I know how to establish my worth in the family. I'm just going to become like the little mom. And so her role was to take care of everything in the family. She has countless memories of trying to gain her father's acceptance or try to save her mother from what were overwhelming burdens for her mom. And as children often do in this situation, she grew up feeling inadequate. And this is an interesting thing. She was inadequate. It was impossible for her to solve her parents' problems. Whatever made her dad be distant, whatever made her mom feel overwhelmed, she was a little girl. And if you take that on thinking, hey, it's my job to make them happy, you're going to feel inadequate because your arms are too short. I mean, you can't fix your parents' problems. But if you take it on as your responsibility, you end up feeling inadequate. And so, ironically, there was something wrong in Helen's life, but it wasn't with Helen. It was the way she was raised. You're not supposed to make kids feel responsible for your happiness. And actually, with her mom, we found out really, she wasn't trying to make her mom happy. She was trying to keep her mom from being unhappy. And that's an impossible job and endless. When do you stop trying to keep someone from being unhappy? You never get there. Because if they're an unhappy person, you just have to keep trying, keep trying. You see, the human mind, you've heard me say this, is like an iceberg. Only 10% of the iceberg shows above the water and 90% of it is below the water. When ships crash on the iceberg, they crash before they ever get to the part they see, right? They hit the part under the water. That's like the human mind. Only about 10% of what's going on in your head is you're conscious of, be aware of. 90% of it is below the surface of the water. Your mind is operating outside of your awareness. So think of it like this. You're thinking things, feeling things, you've got that amygdala in there firing all the time. It's outside of your awareness. And if you can pull these things into view, then you'll see more of what's going on in your mind. That was what was happening for Helen. She was actually still doing battle with these feelings of inadequacy that she didn't even know she felt. She just felt responsible. Responsible to her boss, responsible to be a good person, responsible to work hard, responsible to never say no. But the person she was trying not to disappoint didn't turn out to be her boss. The thing is, with children like this who are raised feeling responsible for their parents' happiness, she grows up not being afraid of disappointing her boss, but she's afraid she already was a disappointment and it was going to get found out. So she's now dragging this around. I know I'm a disappointment. I feel like a disappointment. Never could make mom happy. Never could get dad's attention. I know I'm a failure. I don't want anybody else to find out. So if I work really, really hard, I'll fool you all, and you won't be able to see that actually I'm inadequate, I'm a failure, right? This is a terrible thing to live with, and even a harder thing to admit to itself. This is what we were trying to pull into conscious awareness. You're trying to avoid disappointment. You're believing you already are a disappointment, and you're just found out. That was brutal. She was stuck in a relationship and stuck in a workaholic environment in her house that she couldn't get out of. Not because she was afraid of disappointing her boss, but afraid she'd be found out as disappointed by everyone. And so she just kept working and working and working. She was in the freeze response. She was stuck, frozen, but she couldn't figure out what the problem she was trying to solve was. Right? She was dragging the problem around inside. And she thought the problem was outside. So I would say to all of us, if you feel stuck, you probably have some wrestling to do. To wrestle, and it's usually the wrestling you have to do with yourself. You think the thing is a demanding boss, a demanding job, a spouse who's just too critical, a spouse who's not emotionally available. You think these are the things. The thing is usually not the thing. So whatever you think the thing is, wrestle. Say, what could be under this? Whatever feeling you're feeling, there's usually a feeling under that feeling. And then, yeah, no pointing of fingers. Right. Yeah.
I love that you started with the Genesis story because of the wrestling, and after the whole night of wrestling, he walks with a limp for the rest of his life.
That's right.
But he also walks away blessed and with a new name.
That's right.
And so there's something in that for us with the difficult nature of this work, because it can be hard and painful and unpleasant. And yet, what we could get out of it, or what we can walk away with, is so much more profound.
Transformation, that's right.
Yeah.
And the Jewish people are proud of the name Israel. He struggles with God, right? They're proud of that. We're people who struggle. They're proud of that. We look at ourselves and we're self-examining to a fault. We get educated and we wrestle, and we're not afraid of hard times. And think of the amazing history of Jewish people and what they've dealt with, because they're not afraid to wrestle. They're not afraid of adversity. They're not afraid of hard times coming and saying, okay, we got a job to do. We're the people who wrestle with God. So we're the people who wrestle with hard times. Yes, we're transformed through those wrestling times. And you may walk with a limp the rest of your life, but you'll be a different person. That's exactly right. And that's what we want to take away from this time. This is a time where we will need to struggle. If you feel stuck, it's an invitation to wrestle with God. And it doesn't mean it's going to be easy, and it doesn't mean your life's going to be perfect either. You may walk with a limp, but God offers you the strength to become a better person through the rest of the time. Alice.
You know, I had a medical student stay with me for the last 6 months, and he left. Wonderful, great kid, but I was exhausted. And I was exhausted not because of him. I was exhausted because I kept giving him more and more of myself to make him happy. And I realize now that it's because I grew up with a narcissistic mother, alcoholic father. So instead of running away or being stuck with, the fight and freeze, all of that, I think there is a fourth one, which is accommodating to take the danger away.
Yes.
And that's how I saw it. It's like, I mean, I really had to think about it. It was, if I was a healthy person, I would say, when this person does this, I feel this and this. It's making me feel this way. Instead, I'm thinking, what can I do to make them happy?
Yeah.
And I leave myself. I don't know. So I abandon myself in order to keep the danger at bay.
Right.
So it's like an enabler, I guess.
Enabler, yeah, that's the term. Accommodation is the right term too.
Yeah.
We actually have a term for that in psychology. We call it a pathological accommodation.
There you go. On my gravestone.
Yeah, right. Well, it sounds like you've done some good work out. Yes, and that was Helen's problem too, which she was pathologically accommodated. She thought that's the solution, I've accommodated. And you're right, you lose your sense of self on that. And actually it isn't loving, because she wasn't really being honest about how she felt. So that's not really loving, that's just accommodating or enabling, as you put it. That's exactly right. And people get stuck there their whole life. And it wasn't Helen's fault, it's the way she was raised. Right? So she did what she learned. As you did. We do what we learn, but we can learn new things, right? And in these opportunities, God has not abandoned us. He has said, I'm here to give you strength. I'm not here to make your life easier. I'm not promising you won't walk with a limp, but I can make your life better. I can help you transform through difficult times, but we have to wrestle. So I would say my takeaway is normalize hard conversations about yourself. Make that a normal part of your life. Hard conversations about me. Life's hard. Yes, your boss is difficult. Your job is difficult. Your spouse is difficult. Your kids are difficult. Yeah, okay, I got it. But what you want to normalize is then the hard conversations about you. What is it about you that you need to learn? We're all very good at pointing out what everybody else needs to learn. We're really good at that. But what do you need to learn about this struggle? What can you learn in this struggle about yourself? That's what God wants. He wants to give you a new name. He wants to transform your life as a result of the wrestling, but it's about you. It's not about other people. And it's easy. I know it's what I do all day long. I analyze everybody else's problems. So it's really easy. It's really easy to do. What's hard to do is for you to turn that inward and normalize the hard conversations about yourself. I think we've been called to that at this time, for us to see what we can learn about ourselves. As Helen did, She was all about everybody else. And that's why her boss loved her, her friends loved her, everybody loved her. And yet she was overwhelmed because she hadn't looked at herself. Why was I doing this? Who was I really? What was my fear really? It wasn't disappointing your boss and being found out. If you wrestle with God, you'll find yourself changed. I have found it is really hard to change other people. So you might as well invest that same energy on trying to change yourself. That's someone you do have some influence over. So we are in a time of rest. Great questions. I think that helps us. Usually by now, Jody's got a question of some kind. It's holding you back. Let's talk about fear in marriage. Now I'm going to talk about the Hebrew word that was brought up last week for fear. Psalms 111:10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. You all know that, right? This word fear in Hebrew, it means many things. There's several words for fear in the Bible. Of course, you know the New Testament's in Greek and the Old Testament's Hebrew originally. And this fear of the Lord phrase is used often in the Old Testament. But this word, yirah, is often translated as awe as well as fear. So it has nuances, and it kind of depends on the context is exactly what the word means. But often the awe, A-W-E, the awe and reverence and respect for God is the beginning of wisdom. And so that has multiple meanings, but the one I want to take away from that today is the beginning of wisdom is to realize you're not God. He is, you're not. That's a really important thing to realize in life because we forget that. Believe it or not, you forget that. You think you're God of your own life. You're not. So this fear, this reverence, this respect, and also actually the word yirah also has with it a bit of reverence in trembling before God. Right? You think about it, who are the people that you respect the most? Well, they're people that can hurt you, can hurt other people, but don't, right? So really, the good people, I think, are scary because they're powerful people, but people who don't choose to hurt other people, right? If someone can't hurt other people and don't hurt other people, well, that's nice. But what if you have a powerful person who doesn't hurt other people? That person I respect, right? But they're choosing to live a good life. And the people in your life that you love the most are the people who can hurt you the most. And so you have respect for people who could hurt you but don't. So there is a little bit of a scariness about relationships, isn't there? The people that you really love, also there's awe and respect for them when they choose to be loving people. I love C.S. Lewis's depiction of Christ. He depicts him as a lion, as a roaring lion. In the Chronicles of Narnia, that's no accident. And he says that. This is a dangerous creature here, a dangerous creature who chooses to love. I love that depiction. And Jesus was not weak and passive and unable. He was powerful when he chose to love. That's an interesting kind of truth about life. So the takeaway that I'm going to take from this passage is have the humility to know your limitations. It's really important to know your limitations in life. To know that He is God, you are not, and know your limitations. Especially in marriage, it's important to know your limitations and realize you are not God in marriage. I've talked here before about mirror neurons. We've discovered this just in the last couple of decades. We now know that in not just the human brain, but also some other creatures have these mirror neurons, which means if I see you, particularly another human being, do something, my brain mimics that in my brain. It's like a mirror in my brain. So the example I use is if I say you drink a cup of coffee, I find myself wanting to drink a cup of coffee, right? I'm mirroring, what I see. I know why advertising works, right? And here's the interesting thing about mirror neurons. is that they took the study further and they thought, well, we'll show someone about to drink a cup of coffee and then blank out the picture. And in your brain, you finish the action. You think, oh, no, they were going to drink. So in your brain, you go, no, I actually do want to drink. I don't want to do this. I want to actually drink. So mirror neurons makes you think you know what the other person is going to do. You're anticipating their behavior. So this is hardwired in your brain that when you see someone do something, you think you know what they're going to do next. This is a terrible thing for marriage because you're constantly thinking you know what that other person meant and you know where they were going with this. And you're hardwired to think you know. Here's the thing, you're often wrong. It doesn't just because you're hardwired to do this, and you can understand why we've evolved for this too. If I see someone picking up a spear, I need to know what he's going to do with that spear, right? So I've learned now's the time to run. That guy's going to throw that spear at me. So you anticipate behavior with these mirror neurons. It's terrible in marriage to be anticipating the behavior of your spouse when you think you know what they were going to say before they finish their sentence. You need to actually listen because you can sincerely think you know and be sincerely wrong. Just make that point. In marriage, it takes humility. And I'll give you an example here. So, fear, the Webster's definition of fear. Distressing emotion aroused by impending pain, danger, evil, whether real or imagined. All right, so distressing pain in response to danger, whether real or imagined. And what happens when it's triggered is what's called defensive activity. I'm going to defend myself against this real or imagined fear. The self-protection is meant to be temporary. And we've changed how we deal with defense mechanisms. All of you get defensive. I get defensive. Everybody gets defensive. I got defensive this week several times. I'm in a small group with a couple of guys, a pastor and a psychologist, and I had to confess my defensive acts to myself. It's like my own therapy. I've known these guys for 40 years, and we get together and admit, yeah, I did that too this week, and I'm going to pray for you. Don't do that. Speak that way anymore. We all get defensive. You don't get to a place where you're not defensive. You don't get there. What you need, we all need, is someplace where you can go and talk about it, and somebody can help you see that. Like, yeah, no, that's probably wasn't cool. You don't want to do that. We used to think that the way you get through defenses is to break through them. We're going to break through that. We're going to get people to change. We're going to break through the defenses, get to the real stuff. We don't think that anymore. Now the way we help people with their defenses is to realize that they're scared. Why people get defensive? Because they're in danger, either real or imagined, and so they get defensive. They're defending against the danger. So I don't tell people to break through the defenses. I want them to understand what's scaring them. Actually, in therapy now, when we do defense analysis, we call it danger analysis. If someone's defensive, they're in danger. So I need to help them understand what the danger is, and that's what makes the defenses come down. Not by me arguing with them or pointing it out, or trying to break through the defenses, by helping see that they're afraid. Fear is the signal that something's going on and needs to be paid attention to. You need to understand what that thing is. Maybe you've heard this. A good scare is worth more to a man than a good advice. Yeah, we can learn a lot from those moments, those scary moments. So in marriage, we have the most common problem when people are scared and then defensive is a pursuer, distance, or dynamic. It's really simple. It's really common. Most people do it. What it means is someone, and often it's the wife, but not necessarily, takes on a position of what we call critical pursuit. If something's gone wrong, she knows how she feels. Men are not socialized to know how they feel, so they're a few minutes behind. And so she's upset. He doesn't know what she's talking about. So she tries to pursue the situation. And, over time it gets frustrating. So she becomes a bit critical in her pursuit of the situation. It's called the critical pursuit. The conversation starts off with, we need to talk. And he's looking out the window and trying to get away. And she brings up his character details, try to get into a constructive conversation on how to be a better person. And he does, then the opposite of critical pursuit is withdrawal. Men are really good at withdrawing. We know how to act like we're there, but we're not really there. And I've told you this before, I love this, a guy by the name of Gottman has actually put hardwire electrodes on people so he can measure their heart rate and stuff. And when the typical conversation between men and women, and these roles can reverse too, you know, of course, and gay couples, they have roles too. So it's not set in stone. These are just statistically common. When you know she's critically trying to address the problem and he's like this, his heart rate is beating out of his chest, right? So his blood pressure is shooting up, and it looks like I don't even care. You know, that's how he looks. That's not what's going on. The withdrawal that men do, the way they back away and withdraw, is their way of fighting. And it is very effective because if I withdraw, if I step back, what do you think she's going to do? Come after me, right? So she comes after, he withdraws. She comes after, he withdraws. So we got the pursuer distancer dynamic. It's the most common dynamic. There are many dynamics in marriage, but this is the most common. I'm going to give you an example of it today. This is a mismanagement of the fight and flight syndrome. Critical pursuit, mismanagement of fight, withdrawal, mismanagement of flight. Yes.
I've also, in attachment theory, heard that called anxious avoidance.
Yeah.
Is that similar or is that different?
Awesome. Yes. In attachment styles, same, different language, same dynamic. Yes.
Okay.
In attachment styles, we tend to think that as more stable. People tend to be either avoidant or anxious over time. In marital therapy, these are things that can change quickly. Attachment styles don't change quickly, but dynamics in marriage can change quite quickly once we realize what we're doing. And here's the important thing I want to say to men is you don't realize how damaging withdrawal is. You think, what did I say? It's the not saying anything that's damaging. If you withdraw from a conversation, that injures the person who's trying to connect with you. You're injuring them. By saying nothing, you're injuring them. But men, the withdrawer, doesn't tend to see it that way. They think, I didn't say anything. Look what I have to live with. You know, they think that. And she's coming after him, just trying to get a response out of you. And so he withdraws because he's afraid, and she's pursuing because she's afraid. Let me give you an example. We'll flesh this out. Couple I'll call Drew and Nicole. Stuck at home for almost 2 years now. They both decided to come to therapy because they kept having the same fight over and over and over again. And you're stuck at home 24/7. You got both of them had careers. He had a career as an attorney. And for the last 2 years, they've been living together on top of each other. If you had marital problems before COVID, they had to get worse after COVID, right? Because you're trapped there. There's no break. There's no getting out. There's no, hanging out with other people, getting perspective and thinking, oh, wow, I don't have it so bad at my marriage, because they're out with other people hearing about their marriage. There's none of that now. You're stuck at home without any comparison. COVID has been terrible for marital distress. It's at an all-time high. And people who were in abusive relationships before COVID are in really abusive relationships now. They're trapped. See why. He came from a successful, wealthy family. He was kind of an introvert, very serious, stable guy, non-confrontational, and his family were that way. His parents were married right up until his father died. Nicole, very attractive homemaker, also a part-time architect. They had kids in the home. She grew up with an alcoholic mother who was abusive, dysfunctional family. So his family's intact, non-confrontational, alcoholic family, crazy. So people were fighting. So when he met her, oh, was he in love with her passion? She was attractive and passionate, and she was aggressively facing life and got herself educated, even though her dad was gone, her mom was abusive. This is a fireball. I really am attracted to her energy. She loved his stability, and she said this when she met him, this guy would be a good father. Stable, loving, kind. She knew he would never abuse her like her mother did. This was not the kind of guy who's going to beat up on me like my mom did. He would just always calm, always faced adversity with calmness. as often happens, what attracts us most to people in the beginning becomes the source of irritation over time. It just takes a matter of time before that very thing that you were attracted to becomes something that irritates you. So you picked it. I just want to point that out. Her passion turned into a critical and angry pursuit of him over time. She was passionate, which means when she wasn't getting what she needed, that passion turned into pointing out what was wrong with him. So she would come after him with critical pursuit. You didn't do this, but you said you were going to be home then. You're working what? Another weekend? You know, so it's trying to get what she wanted from him. She became more and more critical. And what did he do? Non-confrontational, stable guy. So a guy who was even tempered turned into the guy who became withdrawn and depressed. He just wouldn't withdraw more. He didn't like to fight. He didn't grow up seeing anybody fight. And so he just felt like this is her craziness from her childhood. And she's abusive, is what he said after her first session. She abuses me. And so as he would withdraw, she would come after him. He would withdraw, she would come after him. And she was chasing him around to try to have a relationship with the guy. And he was withdrawing to try to keep from destroying the relationship. Because he felt if he fought with her the way she fought with him, well, that was going to end the marriage. You know, he had no idea how to fight like she fought. The problem was that they didn't understand what the problem was. She thought she was angry because he was emotionally unavailable. He thought he was angry because she was so critical and harsh. That's what they thought. Right? Neither understood the real problem was they were both afraid. They were afraid. They were stuck in the mismanagement of the fight, flight, and freeze syndrome. She was afraid, actually, what we came to find over time, that he didn't value her or really love her, that really his relationship with his mother and his wealthy family was more important than she was. He was very protective of his mom, and eventually she alienated his mom, and he wouldn't defend her in the way that she wanted. He was always seeing both sides of everything. That made her very afraid. What do you mean? There's no two sides. I'm your wife. You know, you can't see the other side. There's no seeing the other side. So she was afraid that he didn't really value her and he wouldn't speak up. His distancing, his withdrawal made her feel unloved. He was afraid that she didn't really respect him and that actually he really wasn't enough of a man for her because she was always putting him down. And all the money they made, he was quite successful. It didn't matter. If you come home and your wife thinks you don't measure up, and she's telling you that you don't measure up on a regular basis. They were too afraid to be vulnerable. And here's the key in marriage. They were certain they knew what was wrong with the other person, but they were too afraid to be vulnerable in the process. And they thought they knew, thought they really knew what was wrong. Now in marriage, there are two kinds of anger. There's the anger of hope and the anger of despair. And this is important for you to know. Because if you're in a normal marriage, you're angry. You know, it happens. But there are two kinds of anger. The anger of despair says, I give up. I made a mistake. This is wrong. I'm out. That's anger of despair. It means it's over. Anger of hope is we can be better. Anger of hope is I'm mad because I know we can be better. The anger of hope is a good thing. I want to be with someone who cares. I want to be with someone who gets mad when we're not as good as we can be. And someone who's angry because they want to make it better. Because anger at its core is energy to solve the problem. Anger at its core. We're going to talk about that next week. It's energy to solve the problem. And so she was mad and he was mad, but not for what they thought. Both had to have the humility to know that they didn't really know and know the limitations. They thought they knew. Those mirror neurons were telling them, I know what you mean, right? But actually they didn't. And after many sessions of active refereeing on my part, I was calling fouls and I put my foot on this person's throat and I tell that person to shut up. I mean, if you come to my marriage counseling, you're not allowed to actually hurt people. Right? So, and there are couples, this isn't one, I've got another couple here, they have to stand up to fight because they can use their diaphragm, you know. Really put some oomph into that, you know, that protest. We soundproof our offices for this week. I actually got her to soften. That's critical. It's a critical pursuit to get them to soften. I want you to say that, well, let's say it a different way, right? Rather than pointing out his character defects, let's just say how you feel. How about that? and get her to soften her approach and get him to engage, to come out behind that wall and say how he feels vulnerably and recognize, you know what, I thought I knew what was going on, but maybe I don't. So let's see if I can just say how I feel and listen to you and realize my limitations in this marriage. Maybe we can have a conversation. She asked him eventually to forgive her, and he cried at how hurt he saw she was by his words. That was transformed. Because he didn't think he was hurting her. He saw that she was hurting him. That was pretty obvious. Anybody can see that. He never saw how he was hurting her by avoiding her. And once she was able to say that and be vulnerable, he cried, realizing, I guess I didn't really know why you were so mad. You were so mad because you were afraid that I didn't love you. I do love you. And I feel bad that I haven't communicated that. That neither of them had seen that in their 20-year marriage. He wasn't withdrawing because he didn't love her. He was afraid that he wasn't enough of a man. And she wasn't critical because she didn't respect him. She was afraid that he didn't really love her because she'd never really had that in life. She didn't get that from her childhood, but she just assumed she's gonna have to fight for everything, including getting seen in the marriage. So in marriage, it's really good to know you're not God. You think you know what's going on. You could be sincerely wrong. So let's start with that axiom, that you don't really know everything, and that in marriage, when people get defensive, it's because they're afraid. And if you can be vulnerable, if you can be vulnerable, that's the best way to address fear in marriage, by you being vulnerable. And it's the hardest thing to do. You know, if you're afraid and you're being attacked, or you're with someone who's emotionally unavailable, it's really hard to be vulnerable. That's exactly the thing that solves fear in marriage. And especially now at this time, when our marriages are having the most stress they've ever had, now's the time for us to be the best we can at that. Best we can at that. So I brought my clock. I've got 15 minutes, so we'll keep going. Fear of death. I think we need to talk about that. Dealt with that. We'll have people who either nearly died or have passed away. It's touched all of us. It's happened. Hebrews 2:15. And free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Now we've all got some fear of death. It's not unusual. There's some death anxiety among all of us, as we talked about last week. The people who are least afraid of death are either atheists, because they don't have anything to fear, there's nothing out there, or least afraid of the people who are very religious, people who go to church often, have an intrinsic relationship with their God. Those are people who are not afraid, because they know where they're going. They're not afraid. It's the majority of the population, which is in the middle, who are sort of religious. You know, most people believe in God, but most people kind of don't really know what they believe. They just believe in God and kind of go to church. And they're the people who are most afraid of death, because they're not certain. I don't know. Who is God? What's out there? I don't know. So the fear of death is highest in that mid-range population. So self-preservation is natural too. You want to save your life, right? Self-preservation is an automatic thing that we do. But here's a problem. Self-preservation at all costs leads to problems. So if your fear of death is too high, if you're clinging to your life too tightly, then it's really hard to live it. If you're just because you don't want to die doesn't mean you really want to live. They're not the same thing. And some of us this last year, our fear of death has really been spiked for good reason. For all of us. This could happen. This invisible thing could get any of us, and that's called a fear of death in some people to actually be crippling for them. Let me give you an example of that. A woman I'll call Katie came to therapy because she saw her husband almost die of COVID. He declined quickly. He collapsed in their bedroom. They had to call 911. The ambulance had to come, take him to the hospital. Unfortunately, he was intubated, and he survived. Now, sometimes the intubation doesn't work and they have to do a tracheotomy and they go in that way. And it's been brutal for people trying to survive COVID. He did, but he almost passed away. She came to therapy because she saw her life stuck now because of this near-death experience of her husband, the man that she loved and depended on. She said, "Thank God I was there. I shudder to think what would happen if he'd been alone." I said, "That must have been awful." She said, "Yes. And we didn't even know he was that sick. I mean, he was on the edge of death. It's so scary to think that he could have died, that any of us could die at any moment. You just never know when your time is up." So now you see where she's going. She was traumatized. He'd almost died. She became faced with death, and it makes you think about your own death. When you're that close to it, you can't not think about that, right? Thinking about her own death caused her to become afraid of many things. Certainly, traveling now became unsafe. She wouldn't consider traveling anywhere. She told me she couldn't imagine ever flying again, ever, on an airplane. She stopped going out to restaurants, which many of us did, but now she refused to go anywhere at night. Somehow night was now too scary. COVID's worse at night, is it? I don't know. But the fears started to exacerbate. Her life started to shrink down more and more and more. To shrink down her life to a smaller place made it seem more manageable for her. And that's why she came. She was like, "I'm too afraid to do anything. I can't go out. I want to see people. I don't want anyone to come in my house." And we talked about it. And as we talked, we discovered that she had a fear of dying that went back for years, actually all the way back to her childhood. When she grew up, she hated scary movies. She often worried that her parents might die. She would have that thought. And as an adolescent, she would fantasize, well, what would people say at her funeral if she died? Came to an untimely death. Would they be sorry? Would they say nice things? She would think these thoughts, adolescent girls, they think these things. As an adult, she also wondered if her life was worth living. She'd had that thought often. She just never really told me. Would it really matter if I wasn't around? So her husband's brush with death brought all this up. Her fear of death had been her whole life. It's now, for many people, because of COVID, front and center. It's on the front. They can't escape it. Right? I've always had these sort of nagging thoughts. Now they're really clear. And it's causing her to shrink her life. Well, as I often find with people, as it turns out, her fear of death wasn't really a fear of what was going to happen. It's a fear of repeating what has already happened. And that's true for most of us now. When we think, oh, I'm afraid this thing in the future might happen, and this thing out there is going to happen. And it can become almost immobilized by this fear of something out there. If we really look closely, we can find, oh, there was something that's already happened that makes you so afraid of that thing coming in the future. But often our problems aren't what's going to happen. Our problems are what's already happened. There are things that have gone on in her life that predisposed her to be afraid of death. She was afraid of reliving these things. But her fear of death was a way of condensing all the scary things in her childhood that, maybe I would have died, maybe my life wasn't worth living, and she condensed it into one concrete thing, a fear of death. So I wouldn't have to think about all those unresolved fears in my childhood. I just got one thing to fear, that would be death. So we're just focusing concrete, make it something concrete. The problem with her strategy of making all her fears in life condensed into one thing is that if you work too hard to protect your life, you're never going to live it. I mean, restaurants are good things. I think going out at night is really some of the most fun conversations I've ever had. Have been going out at night with people. But if you're too afraid to engage in life for fear of death, you can't live. So self-preservation is important, but self-preservation at all costs. Meaning, I'm going to preserve my life over everything else. I'm not going to take any risks at all. Shrinks your life down to a life that is a livable life. Certainly not a meaningful one. So instead of focusing on what might happen in the future, we spend a lot of time talking about what had already happened in our life. What were the scary things that have already happened? Let's just talk about it. We can't deal with what's going to happen that hasn't happened yet, but we can talk about the impact of things that have already happened in your life. What have been your fears? So in talking about these things and bringing them out into the light, something interesting happened. She wasn't as afraid of the things that were going to happen because we found out that she was really had in this unconscious part of the mind tremendous fears that were unresolved of things that had happened in the past. Scary things stopped being so scary as we brought them out to the light. That's how it works. You keep things hidden and never talked about, they don't change. The only way they change is bring these fears out into the light. If you keep things in the dark, then doing new things seems too radical, and meeting new people sounds boring, and going out to restaurants sounds too expensive, and so you just shrink your life down more and more and more. But if we bring these things out into the light, those fears go away. Now, as I said, in general, Christians have less of a fear of death than most people. Those of us who have a relationship with God, we have a good idea where we're going. We're not as afraid of death, but you can, because if you come close to it, as many of us have during COVID, develop a fear of death that causes you to obsess. If you are, then it's probably because things have already happened that have scared you in life. And those are the things that you might want to spend time thinking about and talking about. How we deal with our fears is by facing them. It's by talking openly about them, not by keeping them secret in the dark. Alice.
So when September 11 happened, I had a huge PTSD from my past. And at the time, my son was much younger, and I told him we need to leave the country and go somewhere else.
Yes.
And he's like where?
Yeah. Where would be better?
Yeah, right. So he helped me kind of reorient a little bit. And then he said, I don't know about you, but I was born here, so this is really my country.
Yeah.
It was anyway. And then when January 6th happened, I went through the whole thing over again.
Yeah.
I was scared shitless, basically. I just wanted to leave. I thought, oh my God, the thing I thought, the democracy, what I relied on is gone, and whatever the fear that came. And I had to really process, and I like what you said, I was holding on to something that might happen, that already happened.
Right.
And that I have no control over.
That's right.
And that I don't even have the whole picture of what the hell is going on from my perspective.
Right.
And I had to really have faith in that whatever happens, I don't have the answers. I don't have the whole picture.
Correct.
And I had to leave it to God. I'm like, you take over, because right now I'm like hanging by a string. And of course, God responded, and he goes, finally, thank you. It isn't your thing, it's my thing. And it's between me and the people that are going into transforming themselves or have the option. So it's like reminding me, God has given us options.
Yes.
Who am I not to give people options?
Good point.
So it was a transformative release and breathing and accepting of people more, and not trying to figure it out, because like what you said, that imitation, like you eat something, you think it's going to be this way and it's not.
Right.
So I don't know. I figured it's humbling.
It is humbling. It is humbling, and we don't know. And that's a really good example, Alice. I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of people take these public events like that and they become terrified.
Yeah.
And they talk to me all the time about it. Oh my gosh, and that tells me, okay, there's probably some things that have already happened to you that are being revived. It's not what's going to happen that's usually your worst enemy, it's what's already happened that's usually your worst enemy. And if you're terrified over an event, it's very likely that there's something in your past that's terrorizing you.
Yeah.
It's what's already happened that's usually our worst enemy, as opposed to what's going to happen. And we do that with politics a lot. This guy really scares me, that event really scares me. We all do that. I think you have a very wise son, sounds like you had a good parent, who could redirect you back to the real root of your fear. It's not what's going to happen, it's what's already happened. Almost invariably you find that when people are terrified. Okay, any other questions? I know my time is up. All right, thank you all for coming. Next week, we're going to talk about what happens when fear goes on too long, and what happens is you get angry. So next week, we're going to talk about anger and how to deal with anger. Because look around, see people are angry a lot. So how can we, what can we learn from this? We'll talk about that next week. All right, I'll see you all then.